Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight here in person and those online at the Newman Center at U of T. We are here tonight. My name is Peter Copeland, and it's my pleasure to bring you another Faith and Reason lecture series here, co-sponsored by the Newman Center, the St. Monica Institute, and Catholic Conscience. Tonight's discussion will be slightly different than other lecture styles. We'll have a short presentation from Brendan Stephen here, followed by a panel discussion with Maria Lucas, who is a lawyer working in Crown Indigenous Relations, Samantha Rossi, a physician in residence at Markham Stouffville Hospital, and unfortunately Robin D'Souza, a postdoc at St. Michael's College, couldn't join us tonight. And we will all be discussing the theoretical understanding of an issue that's very much practical, very much in all of our lives, in the spirit of a Faith and Reason lecture, and that is, turn that into practical questions about how we live our lives. And that question is how we live in community today, how we foster and maintain supportive networks, communities, relationships, and friendships over time. So I would say it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are a host of factors that militate against our ability to foster and maintain deeper relationships in community today, including the prevalence of choice and self-creation as normative for people, which makes life fast and relationships short and transactional. Many of us move around to find new jobs and new experiences on multiple occasions throughout our lives as part of the project that's really normative for us all, which is this authentic self-discovery and self-creation. And the growth of new communications and media technology have created a novel public square and an online culture where connection is instantaneous but disembodied and a bit disconnected. And lastly, we live in an increasingly busy and work-oriented culture. And, Catholics, other Christians, all people really, but in the Catholic context, I think in the parish life, really struggle to bring a cohesiveness and community together in light of this. But in spite of these challenges, there are equally many opportunities to find like-minded people to associate with, new methods of transportation and association, in a world that is increasingly transparent, accepting, and welcoming of positive differences among people. And the communications technology affords us unheard of opportunities for learning and information sharing. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Brendan Stephen up. Brendan is the Executive Director Emeritus of Catholic Conscience and the Chief Writer for the United Jewish Appeal, and he works in the nonprofit sector. Brendan's going to share with us some thoughts about how to strengthen community today. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here speaking to you all. This has been a series of lectures with august names, with many degrees, and so your quality is really dropping tonight with me. But it's great to be here, and thank you to Peter for inviting me, and to SMI and Catholic Conscience and the Newman Center, of course, for hosting us. So I'm going to just talk briefly, I've got my timer on, briefly, about the topic of community before we get into the panel discussion. And there's kind of three things I want to talk about around this topic. One is why does community matter? We may instinctively kind of have that answer in our heads, but I think it's worth dwelling for a moment. Why is this a good that we desire? Some of the contemporary challenges to community, Peter's touched on this a little bit, and then committing to our church communities. So what does it look like in the context of us as a church, in our parishes, in the different Catholic institutions in which we find ourselves? What does that mean to live community as Christian disciples? So a lot of this I'm going to really focus on the church context, but really, I mean, this is, as Peter said, this is an issue that we face outside of the church context in our neighborhoods and our cities, and so this is relevant really for all of us, not just inside of church. I open with this quote because this is a quote that has been really central to my own spiritual journey. Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who lived many, many years of her youth as an atheist, and then had her first child, and as she writes in her autobiography, stared at her baby and was just so overwhelmed by the goodness of it all, just needed someone to thank. And that kind of represented a milestone in a journey that eventually brought her into the Catholic Church. But when she describes the overall arc of her spiritual journey, she describes it in such a way I think that is relevant for all of us in the modern world, which is that we have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, the loneliness many of us experience in modern life, and the love we find in community, and how community is a necessary part of that love that we know as the Trinity, the Christian Church. So why community? Why does community matter? This might be obvious, but it's worth dwelling for a moment that among the many things Christ did when he came to earth is he created a community. The apostles were a community of 12 men. The disciples who followed Jesus were a community. Later on in Acts of the Apostles, after Christ ascends, you have this line that everyone likes to look at and think, oh, this was a little socialist. You know, they held everything in common. There was no private ownership. They lived together. They gave everything of themselves to one another. And while I think we look at this in our modern context and we think, I don't want to give up all my possessions to the Newman Center, I think it still has a really powerful message for all of us, which is everything that God has given us, we are gifted. And that giftedness is to be given back to the people around us. And I think that's a really actually powerful way to think about the idea of community, is the giftedness that we are given, that we give to others. Our neighbors, the people that we live our faith with in the church context. So Christ made a community when he first came among us. St. Paul, obviously, in Corinthians and in other letters, basically gives community advice. How do we all live together without driving each other crazy, right? So, you know, in First Corinthians, he talks about the varieties of gifts disciples receive, but the same God offers all of those gifts. The gifts are given for the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. We're all different, Jews, Greeks, slaves, free, but we're all made to drink of the Spirit. So again, he's advising, this is how we all get along, this is how we live together, this is how we share a mission as a community. The community just doesn't exist for its own sake. It's missional. It exists to go outwards, to make new disciples. So community is very biblical. You know, we need community. It's part of our life as Christians. But a lot of us don't have community. And Peter talked about some of these reasons, but it's worth dwelling, I think, for a moment on some of the challenges of living deep community in modern life that we find. A couple of those are attitudinal. So I would observe that sometimes we treat parishes a little bit like service providers. Parishes are a place we go to get things. I go for the Eucharist. I go to get married. I go to baptize my kids. That sometimes reflects a little bit of a consumerist ideology, which many popes have written about, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis, which is the notion that the world outside of me exists for me to absorb and to take certain things, right, that benefit me. So one of the ways, for example, that consumerist attitude can manifest is in a phenomenon, we may have all heard this term, of parish shopping, right? Where someone moves to a new city and they try out 6 or 7 parishes and get a vibe for the different parish cultures and pick the one that they want, and that's the one I'm going to commit to, right? So again, a little bit of a consumerist attitude sometimes in how we approach that. Part of the challenge is also the rise of what I would call online Catholicism. And this is not a critique, just I think a reality of what it means to live the faith today. We all enjoy a good Bishop Barron video. We all love a little Word on Fire. But I think sometimes the temptation is to absorb our spiritual journey from an online pastor instead of leaning into a real pastor or an in-person pastor, an in-person community, whether in a parish or otherwise, right? And as Peter said, I think that reflects a larger shift in how we live relationship with other people. You know, we can have 1,500 Facebook friends and not have as many actual close friends in our lives. This is also partially a result of ideological polarization. And so I'm not the first to observe that part of the challenges of living community online and having so many relationships online is that it's very easy to mute people that we don't like and that we don't disagree with and exclusively spend our time online and off with people who affirm what we already believe. Communities are very, 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 very messy things that combine a lot of people who might not naturally find themselves going to a pub on a Friday for a beer. You know, it brings together all kinds of people. Disciples are all kinds of people, introverts, extroverts, extremely educated, not educated at all, converted 3 days ago, have been part of the church for 60 years, right? And so the diversity of the kind of people you find in a communal context can be challenging in an era in which, you know, we sometimes expect to be affirmed in everything about who we are and what we believe. Part of this challenge is a non-totalizing faith that can be lived, by which I mean the artificial barrier that we can create between Sunday and Monday, where church is something we do when we go to Mass for an hour on Sunday, but it's not something that imbues every part of our lives, who we are in family, who we are at work, who we are in our civic context, if we're part of the, you know, a political party or a neighborhood association or whatever the case may be. And then lastly, Peter touched on this a little bit, the experience of contingency in social life, by which I mean a lot of our social interactions can be temporary. We move jobs very often, so the colleagues around us are only going to be our colleagues maybe for a couple of years. We move a lot for work. So the friends we make in our parish or the friends we make in our local community, we can only spend time with physically for a couple of years, right? In some cases, that extends even to family. You know, the rise of divorce, for example, family breakdown. So there's an experience of contingency even in that first cell of community, the family environment. So this is a little bit of a scattershot thing, but I hope it demonstrates there's lots of challenges to really living a deep community for us in church. And I could go on, you know, so there's sometimes our culture celebrates wandering. I had a really hard time in university with the fact that a lot of my friends were obsessed with travel. They wanted to go to 3 or 4 countries every year. And now, God bless you if you love to travel. But there was really like a desire for new experiences rather than rooted experiences. So not going deep in one place, but having a little taste in the culinary sense, literally, of lots of different cultures, lots of different places, lots of different people, right? At the same time, kind of in the overall civic space, volunteerism, so just overall participation in civic life, has absolutely cratered. When you look at 50 years ago, there's a book I read on this topic, and the author opened the book by describing the funeral of a man in the early 1900s and how his tombstone was bedecked with all of his memberships. It said, Jimmy, 1860 to 1909, whatever, member Knights of Columbus, member this league, member that league. So much of a person's identity was tied up in their civic connections. I don't think I would put civic connections on my gravestone today, and I don't think that'd be true for many of us. And that kind of reflects an overall decline in participation outside the workspace in the wider society. Related to that is the home as a castle. I grew up in a suburb where we spent a lot of time with family. We spent a lot of time inside the walls of our house. And the time we spent with other people outside of our family environment was very controlled, right? Very, not spontaneous, you know, it was very structured. So again, lots of different things going on here, but just an overall challenge, I think, in our modern culture to how we actually live in deep community with other people. So to go back to Dorothy Day, you know, how do we break this? How do we break our loneliness? There is this cultural trend towards atomization. How do we get out of that? Well, here's my good news. If community is now countercultural, I don't think that should scare us as Catholics, because if you look at history and today, we are very, very good at counterculture. So the muscles are developed. We can really live out as part of our witness, as part of living as salt and light in the world. I think we can demonstrate what it looks like to have a deep commitment to authentic community where we are. So what could that look like in a Catholic context? And once again, I'll hit you with some scattershot thoughts here. I think we can have a deep commitment to spiritual friendship. I think sometimes, and I'll speak from my own experience, we can sometimes place a boundary in our friendships where friendships are, I'll use the word secular. it's someone I spend time with, I talk to about work, I talk to about friends, I gossip, whatever, right? And often those conversations don't shift into Jesus. We don't talk about our faith. We don't talk about our discipleship. I think one of the most powerful things we can do is normalize friendships that do both of those things. That we can not just talk about, hey, how was your weekend? Hey, how is work treating you? We can also talk about, hey, I was praying and I thought about you. Hey, I heard this in Mass. I read this in Augustine or something I was reading. Like, we can normalize spiritual conversations, especially in an era, I think, where there's less interest in spiritual conversations, especially among people who are not part of the faith community, right? Like I said earlier, we can embrace the messiness of community. When I wasn't a practicing Catholic for many years, and when I came back, one of the hardest things I found was spending time with people that I wouldn't necessarily be friends with otherwise, right? But you have to kind of embrace that a little bit. Like, Christ is going to constantly put in your path people who challenge you, who have radically different personalities from you, and there's a beautiful growth and sanctification in that, and that you have something to offer them as well. I think we can really renew the house church as a space for fellowship. I've encountered different Catholic groups, movements, organizations, and I've noticed the difference between the ones where everyone invites you over for dinner and the ones where they don't. The intimacy, the joy of a space where someone welcomes you into your home, which is a place not just of safety, but of openness and warmth and expressiveness. Peter talked about authenticity, expressiveness of a person's personality. All of that comes together in the house environment. So I think it would be wonderful to normalize just making the house not just a domestic church for our families, but a domestic church literally in the sense of a place where our wider communities gather. An intentional nourishing of apostolic creativity in the parish, so encouraging lay leadership, encouraging lay involvement, finding ways to nourish and to encourage people to notice where the gaps are of how we minister in a parish context, and saying, hey, if you have a great idea, I'll help you do it as a pastor or whatever. Get out there, let's do it, right? A plan of life. And I think this goes back a little bit to the distinction between Sunday and Monday, is to really think about how we engage in apostolate as Christians when we're not in our church community. So, I go into my workplace and I'm not going to throw the Bible on someone's desk, but even the simple act of having a crucifix at your desk, praying at lunch, being willing to talk about your life outside the office, which includes your participation in the church community. So just things like that, normalizing how we have those conversations and being willing to be open to say, yeah, I'm part of a wider church community. It's part of my life. It gives me a lot of joy. Things like that. The simple hospitality of invitation that goes back to the church, to the house church point. And then again, I'll end with this, discerning deep commitment. And I think this is probably one of the most countercultural things we can do, is to make the decision, if it's appropriate in our lives, to say, I'm going to make a deep commitment to a place, to a parish, to a people, to a cause, that is going to take up some part of my life, perhaps for the rest of my life. And again, the contingency doesn't go away. People move for work. These are natural parts of life today. But to really make a choice, I'm going to go as deep as I can where I am and to see what fruits God produces from that experience. And I think if we all did that, that would be an incredibly powerful thing. I think as well the Synod on Synodality that we're going through represents an extraordinary opportunity for deepening community. One of the things we do in community is listen to one another's experiences and discern together how we should proceed forward, which is the entire point of synodality, as the Pope has told us. And the other big point of synodality is really to encourage people to step up in leadership in the church and to take on the challenges presented by modern times and to seize them as opportunities. And there's my timer. I'm going over time. What's new, Peter? I think we have to think about, I'll take one more minute, I promise. I think a thing we have to think about, too, as we think about what it means to deepen communities, which necessarily involves intimacy, trust, closeness. Sometimes that can create insularity. Right? I think we've seen that. So we always have to think about how we're fishing. At the same time that we're building that intimacy within the body of Christ, how are we always inviting people to come join us? And that's, I think, a challenge of deep community in the church in our time, is always finding that balance between intimacy and invitation. So once again, I'll end with this. Like, I think this is a big part of how we're called to live as Christians going forward, is to live real community in a time when it's hard to do that, and to discover love in all of that. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
It's a beautiful image, so we'll leave that up. Thank you, Brendan, for a very vivid diagnosis, assessment of our times, and also remedies. So I'd like to spend some time discussing what you've presented for us with our panelists. And with the medical metaphors, we might as well start with you, Dr. Rossi.
I didn't see that one coming. Brendan, that was fantastic. I think you touched on so many things that I know we're going to get into more depth throughout our conversation as well. I think there were a few things that stood out to me. That idea of bringing love into community and, welcoming people into our actual physical homes and acting with authenticity. I think that's what makes communities really remarkable. And I think just to add to that, in some of the missionary organizations that I've worked with over the years, one thing that they always tell us, because we're like, how are you so joyful? And how do you do things so beautifully together and have so much energy? And they always go to prayer. That's the number one thing fueling their initiatives, fueling the way that they love, fueling the way that they offer themselves to other people. We're not all called to be religious, but spending some time in prayer every morning, half an hour. The missionaries do an hour of adoration every morning. I think that's just so beautiful. So kind of fueling yourself so that you're able to give of yourselves to other people is, I think, really important. The other thing that struck me was online communities. So yes, Word on Fire, I love it. Pints with Aquinas, I love it. I'm watching it all the time. And I think, there is a degree of community that comes from that, but these are people, by and large, that we're not actually meeting ever in person. And so, it's good to form ourselves and to inform ourselves through these sorts of mediums. But I think it's also important that we're investing, as you said, in person in our kind of physical environments and offering ourselves and giving of our gifts to the people around us.
Over to you, Maria. Yeah.
Turn this on. Yes. That was a wonderful presentation. There's a couple of things that struck me. One was around this notion of really rooting yourself where you are and really giving of yourself in that space. One thing I've been reflecting on quite a bit over this past year, and full disclosure, my context is I'm an Indigenous person, and relationships are very central to our world view and paradigm and how we understand and live life. And I've been thinking about how that sort of worldview applies within a church context. And when we think about mission and missioning, right, there's this notion that you're in a place for a time and then you might have to move, right? And when I think about the church and the Indigenous community, maybe this is a radical thing to say, but I think that's one of the reasons why it's hard for the church to really root itself, because there's constant movement in those spaces. Priests flying in maybe once a month, right, to say Mass, right? And that makes it very hard to foster a relationship with the church, let alone produce vocations, right, in these spaces. So I understand the missionary spirit, and I understand that's part of what Jesus himself lived. But I think to pause and think about how that may not actually be beneficial for the growth of the church in certain spaces. And again, I'm speaking of the Indigenous context, because that's the context I operate in a lot. How that actually might be detrimental. So that was one thing I was reflecting on when you had talked about being deeply rooted where you are. And yeah, I agree with everything Samantha had just said as well. Finding that balance between invitation and intimacy, not being so insular that you fail to go out at the same time.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Brendan, before we move on? Move you along. Okay, well, I think, you've touched on many of the themes that we'll return to again. So before we do that, I'd like to ask the three of you, tell us a bit about your life in community, both in and outside of the church today and when you grew up. What are some of the trends you've seen? How would you characterize it? Is it healthy? And then secondly, what do you see among your peers and culture more broadly? What are the major trends? We'll start with you, Samantha.
Yeah, so I'd say that community has always been a really big part of my life. I wouldn't say it was always the church community necessarily. Growing up, I think I always understood the importance, or just loved belonging, as we all do. We're all searching for love and meaning and belonging in various spaces. So I grew up playing a lot of competitive sports, and I was always part of a soccer team growing up. And I think that's where I first loved the idea of community and liked being part of a collective that was working towards something greater than ourselves. And it, even within the church context, because I grew up Catholic, but more of a cradle Catholic, not necessarily church going all the time. One thing that definitely kept my interest as a kid going to church was being part of the choir. And that's something that my parents decided to do for us. So, sometimes our parish communities can be very large. There's lots of different mass times, lots of people coming in and out. You'll recognize faces, but not always know names. And there's always just a little degree of separation in that. But being part of a choir growing up, I definitely got to know some people one-on-one and learned lots of different skills too. I had lots of kind of mentors and friends that wanted to teach me how to sing and all these sorts of things. So from a very young age, I would say I saw the importance of community. And I think that's definitely continued as I've gotten older. When I went to university, I really sought out a Catholic community while I was there. I knew that my faith was important to me, so I got involved in our Catholic chaplaincy at McMaster, and lots of other groups too. I have a whole list of things that I'm involved in that, because I really do think that belonging and, offering your gifts, but also receiving from others and kind of this give and take is important. So, our Toronto Catholic Doctors Guild, our Canadian Physicians for Life group, my friends, Missionaries of the Poor, lots of different groups essentially that I would say I belong to and that I try and invest my time in, both within the church and outside of the church. Just in terms of, the trends that I see, I think if I were to kind of characterize myself in a greater kind of context, I think maybe I'm a little countercultural or a little different. I think that most people probably aren't as involved in lots of different areas, or perhaps in secular culture, maybe not necessarily looking towards a church community. But I would say that, people are attracted ultimately to things that will be meaningful and that are going to feel authentic to them. So I've seen that kind of manifest in many ways. I've got, some friends that have decided to go into more kind of rural communities. They've left the city and they thought, the city is just too big and bustling and I'm not forming any meaningful connections here. And so they've opted for places like Barry's Bay or Kingston or other smaller communities where they're feeling like they have more authentic connections there and maybe just the numbers are smaller. I've definitely seen people also, move abroad for, to seek opportunities or learning. And so, these online communities, church communities, Matt Frad's been saying everyone's just like flying to Stephenville and moving there, or Texas, because there's a really strong Catholic community there and people want to be able to raise their families and to be exposed to the Catholic faith. And I think, there's a lot of goodness in that as well. But then I do know also lots of people that have decided to root themselves here in Toronto, kind of where they were born and raised, and to stay around here and look for ways to build community. We've got lots of young adult ministries that have been popping up in the GTA through the Archdiocese that are beautiful, and I've seen a lot of people investing time into those communities and building them up, and lots of other communities that we have in Toronto. So I'd say it's really a mixed bag in terms of what I've been seeing amongst my friends. Maybe it comes down to personality or circumstance, but I think people genuinely are just looking for authentic connections, and there's all sorts of ways that people are pursuing that.
Maria?
So in reflecting on this question, I know that for me, I've I've been blessed to have friends from many different walks of life. And I think that's partly because I'm someone who holds multiple identities. I'm a Black Indigenous woman. I'm a lawyer. I'm a Catholic. Like there's a lot of intersectionality, and that I think provides an avenue to connect with people, or at least a medium through which to attempt to understand and empathize with them. So I've been very blessed in that regard. But I would say that the hardest place for me to actually have been able to connect and form genuine friendships, and I was talking a little bit about this with Brendan earlier today, is actually within the church, of all places. Brendan had spoken a little bit on the church's current synod on synodality, and I had the opportunity, very blessed to have participated in that project to some degree, in a project called Doing Theology from the Peripheries. And I wouldn't say that because I consider myself as an individual in the peripheries of the church, but I definitely, as I was saying before, because of the multiple identities I hold, I'm involved and connected with groups who definitely feel like they've been alienated from the church and from the life of the church. So it's been difficult to subsequently to really feel at home in the church. I know that growing up, we went to my family, took us to church on Sundays, but we always felt quite disconnected from our parish community, and that's partly because of geographic distance. Like I grew up in a rural community, so it's partly that, but I also think partly how we the kind of family we are, culturally speaking, and the kind of community I grew up in, which was not very culturally diverse. So yeah, and then transposing that to a place like Toronto, where there's multiple cultures and people from different backgrounds, and I was expecting there would be more cohesiveness actually within the church, and I didn't actually find much of a change or much of a difference, unfortunately. So sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I know that I don't want to miss anything. But in terms of looking at opportunities to connect within the church, is I've had the opportunity to work in youth ministry. So I was both a beneficiary of youth ministry as a high school student, and then I also worked in youth ministry as a young adult within the Archdiocese of Toronto. And I would say that experience exposed me to different sort of groups within the church in a way that I didn't expect. The church in and of itself is a very diverse community. It's just very decentralized and not very connected. And I would say that the relationships I formed through that ministry, they're lifelong. And I really don't take that for granted, because it was an opportunity to really do a deep dive, I guess you could say, into the relationships that I now have with these people. Do a deep dive into their lives, right? And that's, when we talk about building community and building relationships, it requires that deep dive. It requires that time and that commitment, and that in a way complicates our lives, right? To do that deep dive, because for some, it's just the capacity to do it isn't there, right? So I've been very blessed to have these opportunities to be able to do that. And I think that the church in general needs to sort of create and foster those opportunities for us to do that as church on a daily, maybe not daily basis, but within our parishes and within our communities.
Very good. And last but not least, Brendan.
Hello. Yeah. I mean, so for me, I think there were kind of, as I was growing up, like kind of, let's say, 4 moments of community. I was a big theater kid when I was young. You look at me like you're not shocked, yeah. But and what was interesting about that experience of community, if anyone's done theater, like they're very, they just like, they have an energy with each other that's really like palpable and powerful. And it's partially like when you're a bunch of weirdos, like you're like, there's just something beautiful about coming together in that. And just like, because, you know, when we were that age, like when you're a theater kid, like you feel like an outsider. And so like, there's really an interesting cohesiveness that comes out of that outsider experience, which that's a whole other conversation about community. My next big experience of it, like as I started to, when I went to university and started to go through professional life, I started my career in politics, so I was very, very involved in a political party from high school through university to the first couple of years of my career. And that is political parties are like a version of a community, and I'm being very careful as I say that, because they're a community that has a sense of their ends. Peter's favorite word, their telos, which is we have a set of ideas we share and we would like to win elections and put those ideas into action. And so there's a degree of cohesiveness within that, but political parties are also like notoriously factional. So within that, there are people with radically different ideas who would not normally find themselves in the same kind of room with one another. And so at the same time as you have that sort of, let's say, I'll use the word missional, that kind of outward missional focus, you also have this inward constantly yelling at each other. So, and what's interesting too about that experience of community was it was partially a professional one, which I think adds a very interesting element to a community experience. Like, I have some friends who work on Bay Street. One of them works for one of the banks. And what's interesting about when you work for one of the banks in Toronto is you could live your whole life in the professional circle of the bank. Not just in the sense of you could work for 50 years for RBC or TD, but like your rec league is, you know, is literally different departments, like in the rec league, and you know the family get-togethers are with other bank employees, and the Christmas party is your big Christmas party. So you can have this, like, it's interesting how the professional element can kind of create this mix, and that was my experience with the party, where you were working all day for them, and then all your friends at night were in that same milieu. So it's a very kind of totalizing experience of community. When I came back into the church as a practicing Catholic in 2016 or so, this would have been, one of the interesting things about that experience was, to your point, like struggling to find a really, really deep community. So the first few years I was practicing again was just like desperately seeking out, like, because Catholicism is, I know this is tropey to say, insanely diverse. You know, and your experience of the faith can be so different whether you walk into Opus Dei or Communion in Liberation or a Basilian parish or a Newman Center. Like, it's just the culture, let's say, of how the faith is practiced is so diverse that it just really blows you away. And admittedly, you know, I just made a presentation criticizing parish shopping, did some versions of parish shopping. So, but all to say, to speak a little bit actually to your point, Maria, around how that can be a bit of a struggle, just that cultural diversity. At the same time that is very much true in my experience, on the other side, it does create this something I'd never experienced in my life, this interesting sense of solidarity with people you have nothing to do with. So, like, as an example of this, I saw on Twitter yesterday the Fiji's rugby team at the Rugby World Cups. Before every game, they sing a hymn together. And I don't understand a word of this hymn. I don't speak this language, but it's these like giant rugby, theater kid, didn't know a lot of rugby guys growing up, giant rugby guys, arm in arm in a circle, and they are just singing praises. And I'm watching this, and I'm like intensely moved by this. And so to have an experience of community, of having something fundamental to your life and your identity and who you are in common with these guys halfway across the earth who have nothing to do with your life, who don't even speak the same language, all to say, so like at the same time as that diversity of church can be very challenging from the perspective of intimate relationships and networks, it can also be insanely beautiful. It's one of those like both and moments in my Catholic life that I've found really stunning when I kind of sit in the creative tension of it. And now, yeah, like, you know, I've been really fortunate. Like, Peter and I are part of a men's group together. My parish experience has been one of deep community. So now I feel like there is a little bit of that rootedness that I feel in my kind of local context. So anyways, that's been my experience.
Very good. Thinking back on the 3 now, I'm going to get out my community scorecard. And I think, you know, maybe Samantha and Maria, you had it earlier in your lives in the church and without. Maria, maybe less so in your, you know, parish direct. And Brendan, like myself, seeker and searcher. But now we're doing much better on the community front. But I think, you know, maybe Samantha and Maria, it was kind of in the water and imbibed that, you know, all of these practices, there are things you did, things your family did because they were ingrained. Perhaps, maybe you can comment further. And, you know, some others, not so much. And I think this term, thick and thin community, it's something that comes up to describe different cultures and how they, you know, form, how porous they are, that sort of thing. That's a real differentiator here. So I want to ask you all about that question. So our culture, generally, not inside the church proper, but, you know, many Western cultures are described as thin. Thick cultures are ones, though, that have grown and developed over time. They're passed down through generations. Higher levels of homogeneity in cultural beliefs and practices. It can lead people to be closed off to the world, to cultivate a very strong sense of us, and, you know, negative portrayals of others, and also all of those wonderful fruits of community, which are attachment, connection. Really, a lot of the opposite of what many of us, you know, feel today, which is alienation and lack of connection. And that thin culture, yeah, it can be very dissatisfying. It can be very dizzying, and, you know, even when we don't integrate, it can even heighten social distrust. Now, I think you know, many would describe the church as too thick in its contexts, but, you know, on the other hand, it exists all around the world and in many different manifestations, as you've alluded to. So it's just some of those thoughts about the differences between thick and thin cultures, you know, their advantages and their disadvantages. How do you think about striking the right balance between the two? What are some thoughts about that? Maybe we'll start with you, Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very nuanced thing to contemplate and to think about. I mean, so one of the things that defines any community, and we can use the church as an example, one of the things that defines any community is boundedness. I think sometimes our world doesn't like thinking about the fact that, you know, social groups have borders around them, but just borders are reality of social life. One of the things that defines a community is there are things that define a person who's part of the community, and there are people who are outside of that boundary, right? You know, in a church context, you can have the most on-fire convert on God's green earth. He read scripture yesterday and he's ready to go. He believes, God bless him, but he's still got to go through an RCIA process before he can start receiving the Eucharist. So all communities have boundaries. So boundaries are not a bad thing. The question, I think, really becomes, what are the barriers to entry? And are they barriers to entry that affirm the values of the core of the community and the values of participation, or are they things that kind of arbitrarily leave you outside? And I was talking about this. This is the missional component, right? So if I may engage in a poor man's version of apologetics, you know, this is one of the problems with the notion of predestination, right? Is that boundary of who's allowed to be saved and who isn't is predetermined, and therefore we're the good guys, you're the bad guys, God bless you, good luck, right? That would not be a missional church if we were to believe that theologically. So there's a real, there's a nuance here, and there's a struggle with this, is to always be negotiating that tension, and in a good sense of the word, it's a tension. The tension between how do we define who we are, what do we believe, how do we act in the world, how is that cohesive, as cohesive as a church of 1.2 billion people can possibly be, while at the same time always looking outwards and inviting people in. I think sometimes the mistake we make in the church is to think of hospitality and invitation as like just being a nice dude and offering a person a coffee after Mass, right? But actually, I think part of what makes the church attractive and what helps others encounter Christ outside the church is the cohesiveness that is internal to the community, right? We believe certain things. We behave in certain ways. We have a relationship with Christ and with the church that has certain determinations and limits, right? And I think that is one of the things that makes people want to participate, rather than just affirming, let's say, any old thing as something that can be part, or a behavior or a value or whatever the case may be, that can be part of the church community. I don't know if that made any sense, but that's the nuances of that, I think.
Yeah, there's a proper boundedness, and there is one that excludes arbitrarily. I think that's really rich, a good way of thinking about it. Samantha?
Yeah, totally agree with you. I think there's going to be a lot of both and kind of statements this evening. Yeah. So, there is a beauty that we have in passing on our culture and our church traditions. And at the same time, each of us needs to be really mindful of the risk that we have of perhaps excluding or closing off our communities to people from the outside. And I think really what it comes down to is how we approach the people that we meet. So really trying to strive for virtue all the time and not getting complacent. I think about my grandparents. They were, both sets were immigrants to Canada in the 1950s, 1960s. And I still hear stories from, my very elderly grandmother about how difficult it was to immigrate here. And even though they're Catholics and technically, part of the dominant kind of church tradition, they were still excluded in many ways. They were teased for their food and their olive skin tone and, their weird names that nobody could pronounce. They experienced a lot of hardship and difficulties and, poverty and all those sorts of things, and trying to integrate into the culture, right? But they did share the faith, and hopefully that helped somewhat. But I think we have to be really mindful as a church and as individuals within the church of how we're treating people and how we're reaching out to them, and really trying to have that missionary mindset, as we were talking about before. And what's so core and important to that is that we do things with love, and that we're approaching people with love. As an undergraduate student, I remember we were not a CCO campus per se, but we took on kind of the CCO sort of vibe or mission of going out onto the campus and then meeting people, telling them about our club, and then, kind of following up after to see if anyone was interested in, in either joining the Catholic club or learning more about Catholicism. And one thing that struck me when I was first kind of recruited, so to speak, and then thereafter, was the importance of not just going out to get numbers or to find people that are like-minded, but to genuinely form friendships with people, because that's ultimately what's going to touch their heart, that's going to draw them and keep them there. And again, it's not meant to be just a way to get numbers, or it's really meant to, help us to grow in love and to grow in virtue, and to, show people the love of Christ and to introduce them to it so that we can continue to grow. So I think it's really important in all of our interactions to remember why we're passing on our traditions and our beliefs, and to invite people, of course, having those boundaries in mind. We don't want to, there's definitely the threat these days of secularism kind of taking over, but we do at the same time have to have those boundaries, but really be open to inviting people and approaching them with love.
Yeah, so many thoughts, nuanced and both and all the gray in between. But one thing that I was reflecting on when thinking about this question is how, particularly, just to kind of go, trying to tie two questions together. So your question about modern trends and thick versus thin culture. And one modern trend that I've found and that I think is sort of leading to this a thick culture, is people solidifying community around personal identities. And I know that I'm about to contradict myself, because I just said that the fact that I hold multiple identities has been helpful in terms of connecting with people. So it's not to say that you should not form communities based on personal identity, but I think the danger in doing that is that you can formulate these thick cultures that become insular, and that you end up there's a danger of closing yourself off from other people. So the church can do that and is notorious for doing that. But we can also see that outside of the church, and the trend that I see is certainly around personal identity, whatever that may be. Maybe it may be on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, whatever it may be. So I think that once we do that, there's a danger of plateauing in terms of your growth as a human being. As you were saying earlier, Brendan, like when you came back into the church and you were genuinely seeking out connection, you found yourself talking to people that you otherwise wouldn't have spoken to, right? And I think that's good. That's what we're called to do. That's what we're meant to do. Evangelization is a conversation, right? And you're not going to be able to have that conversation if you're just in an echo chamber. And I just think that this trend of forming communities solely on the basis of personal identity is drawing us away from that mission. And I think we need to figure out how to ensure that our personal identities actually service it.
One follow-up for you, Rhea, in particular, on this question of intersectional identities and really diversity within a unity. Toronto, very multicultural city. Canada, many other Western nations are, have had for many years large levels of immigration, and this brings many great boons, positive acceptance of people, broadening your horizons, a kind of dynamism to the culture. And you've also described a couple times tonight, finding that in there being so much variety, you might say, or maybe groups in particular that you could identify with, that has increased social connectedness for you. But I think it's fair to say many people would observe factors that and realities that it's very much the contrary in other circumstances. Really, because there are so many people moving around all the time, different beliefs. It's just more difficult to share spaces together, from shaking hands differently to different worldviews, right? And I think integration is very key for finding that healthy balance. But I wanted to ask you in particular, what do you find that in our current state here in Canada, the multicultural diversity, the pace or the current state of it is increasing or making it more difficult to form tight communities?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think that what's key in terms of forming an integrated community, one that's cohesive, is obviously an openness to the other, an openness to understanding the, sorry, I'm distracted. So openness and understanding of the other. And I know that that's not necessarily easy, right? That's like we talk about community and unity and diversity, and that's like Canada's catchphrase, and it's really hard. That's actually a really difficult thing to do. Unity and diversity, there's inherent tension in that. And that inherent tension, I think people have a hard time feeling that or living with that. And so that's why they sort of just revert to the communities that they feel more comfortable in and talking with, hanging out in echo chambers. I think that, and I get that, like I get that inclination, but it doesn't help to foster that ultimate goal of that unity in diversity. And I think particularly in the church, I mean, if Catholicism means universal, then that means that you're going to live your faith with a whole lot of tension. With a whole lot of tension. That's part of the calling. That's part of the calling to be a Catholic. And I think asking for that grace to be open, asking for that grace to understand, is what will help us get there. I know that for me personally, as someone who holds multiple identities and thinks about questions of reconciliation quite a bit, it's not an easy road. I've sort of just come to the conclusion I've come to at this stage in my life, or at this point in my journey, is just learning how to live in peace with the tension. And I can only do that with grace.
Yeah, some of the solutions are simple, and maybe that's what's so difficult about them, isn't it? Yeah. Two questions: friendship and commitment. Friendship. Aristotle describes three types: utility, pleasure, and virtuous friendships. And virtuous is the ideal, I guess we would say. I want to say, though, again, for many of the factors we've discussed today, friendships of compatibility, like kind of like a puzzle piece mentality to friendship. Again, one that's it's all comfort, that sort of thing, is what we look for. And you're both extracting kind of mutual enjoyment from each other, and that's the approach. I'd like to ask you, Brendan, about how you've thought about friendship and how you approach it. I know you have kind of a thoughtful approach to it. You maybe have generated over time, and then Samantha, about commitment. So commitment. I think it's a word that maybe some of us are not, but I think many people are allergic to these days, right? Because it means surrendering your freedom to someone or something or some cause, and that's very difficult because there's so many choices out there. And gosh, I wouldn't want to choose anyone and be closed off to others. Yet, we know that commitment is essential for the deepest forms of love, even more shallow forms of association and what have you. So, Samantha, ask you about what you see kind of in the culture and your friends about that. But we'll start with you, Brendan.
Well, first, you'd have to ask my friends how thoughtful I am about my approach to friendships. Friendship. So So I've lived in a few different cities now and spent a good deal of time in each one. And I'm sure this is a very common experience, so this will not be alien to anyone. The strange experience of living in a place, becoming very good friends with someone, and then moving away. And then having to do that negotiation of, and I'm very poor at this, do I call them once a month, or do we just have a WhatsApp group chat and we talk all the time on there, but it's like a message chat, and there's only so much closeness that can be had in that milieu, or is it the kind of friendship? I think we've all experienced friendships where you don't see someone for a very long time and then you see them again, and it's like you pick up exactly where you left off 8 months ago. So I'm really struck by the resiliency of friendship in that sense, of how when a real connection is made, how that can even sort of withstand the test of time in many ways. But it also, I think, it falls into our approach to friendship can fall into that trap of contingency that we experience in all of our lives, and it's one that I experience all the time, which is at different times of life, it's easier with certain friends, right? They happen to be in your work. They happen to be your next door neighbor. They happen to be your college roommate, right? And so we're always kind of in that flux of who is close to us and who is far away from us, and how do we navigate that? At the same time, though, I really find, as at least in my own spiritual journey, the presence of friends has been the presence of Christ for me in just a really unique way. When someone who really loves you and cares about you and wills your good says that right thing to you, in a spiritual conversation or otherwise, says that right thing to you, shares that right insight, offers that right critique, or that right, you haven't thought about this, or perhaps you should stop doing that not nice thing. Like that's one of the great things about being married. you figure that one out pretty quickly. But so friendship is such a privileged space, I think, for not just our sanctification, but that missional piece that we've been talking about all night, that reaching outwards. I think the thing I struggle with a lot since I came back to the church is having so many friendships from a time in my life in which I wasn't Catholic, and them not always reflecting the fullness of my faith that I'd like to live. On the one hand, so there's the bounded community side of me. On the other hand, just loving them so much, and even despite those awkward moments or weird conversations or comments that I have to go to confession about, the wanting to continue to be friends and love them for who they are, and to experience Christ in them, in all the messiness of that being the case. I experience this all the time in my own approach or my own friendships, and so I find too that, I don't know, there's just such a beauty in all of that, and it's one of the things that I love so much about the fact that we are a community, because to go back to your point about, virtuous friendships, Aristotle's idea, the beauty of like a real deep spiritual friendship, of a person who would be your friend, never mind the faith, but then there's also the faith and that shared desire to grow as disciples, and that's just like, there's something so incomparably beautiful in that. It's just one of the most beautiful things you can experience, I think.
Commitment. So you asked a little bit about committing to things or to paths, but also to people. I think certainly our culture has been struggling with making commitments. I see it very frequently, even online, where you'll see, any number of events pop up on Facebook, or let's say you decide to create an event and invite a bunch of people to it, and you'll get maybe half the list saying maybe, just basically indecisive or just not committing either way. And then, as it's approaching, you're trying to get your numbers and figure out, okay, who's coming, who's not. And, maybe a small number of that list will end up committing. Hard to say, but basically what I notice people doing is waiting until the last minute and seeing if something more exciting is going to come up so they can commit to that other thing instead. And I think this is really concerning, because I think it just shows a really lack of honor for our word, and just the lack of respect for other people's time, for their efforts, for their feelings, and instead kind of prioritizing me and making it all about me and what I can extract out of experiences or out of other people. And so this personally really bothers me. I think it's very concerning in our culture. And, I'll talk a little bit about my own struggles with committing to things or pathways. But I think when it comes to people, it's so, so important that when we give our word to people, that we honor that word. And if, something comes up, obviously, but to make it, a regular habit to be there for people, to show up for people, I think is so important. And that's something that, since I've been very young, and maybe, I don't know, sometimes it could just come down to conscientiousness. I'm not sure. There's lots of different thoughts on this, but it's something that's really important to me, is just to be there for people. And I think our culture definitely needs to start doing more of that. I think, when it comes to committing to pathways or to things, that whole I guess the paradox of choice, right? So that we talked a little bit about before. There are just so many options out there right now. Which place am I going to travel to, or who, which degree am I going to decide to choose, or even in my own career path in medicine, which specialty am I going to go into? You guys would totally laugh at me, but less than a year ago when I was deciding which area of medicine I wanted to choose, it was like a couple days before, and I was still like, I don't know which one. I kind of stuck between two. And even, as a high school student, I decided my undergraduate program was actually arts and science because I just couldn't choose between the two. But I personally, and I think other people struggle with this as well, kind of committing to something and like choosing it and following through with it is something that can be really challenging. And I found that challenge with myself. One way that I think that I've personally remedied that, and I'm still very much a work in progress, is just through discernment and really taking the time to pray about it. Obviously, using your reason and reflecting on all the gifts and talents that the Lord has given you, where there may be openings in various areas in terms of whether it's job market or even just needs within the community. But then really spending the time in prayer to hear the Lord's voice and to really, try and do what he's asking of us to follow God's will. And I think that's something that can be very challenging for a lot of us. And I think what it really requires is silence and spending time, daily, creating that space for ourselves to really listen to God's voice and to not be kind of swept away by all the busyness that's going on around us. And then, if you're like me, sometimes it's just like you can't make a decision. Some of us, I think, struggle with that. But I think cultivating that silent time to listen to God's voice and kind of being attentive to our gifts and our talents, and then all of that in mind, committing, following through, showing up. I think that's a really important thing that demonstrates love for God and love for our neighbor.
All right. One more for you, Maria, and then a last one for the group. Pope Francis references the parable of the Good Samaritan in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And, it demonstrates, I think, this tension between who we commit to, the places we think we inhabit, and that these inherent tensions. So, and it's something he uses this parable to model his idea of encounter and social friendship, because friendship is something that we don't do. Our friendships are with select few people, but we really ought to try to broaden that as well in a certain way. So a few things stand out about the parable. First, it involves people who are religious and from different groups. So the Samaritans themselves are quasi-pagan outsiders of the Jews of the land. And second, it models for us the fact that we always have to start right where we are with our neighbors. It's very easy, again, due to the prevalence of choice and opportunity, to become attached to abstract values that we associate with, and we care a lot about that group or that thing, yet we don't even know our neighbors, or we pass by the Samaritan. That's all too easy. And I think the point of stressing it in the encyclical is that to foster encounter and closeness, it has to start primarily right there, right where you are, with people who are different from you, with people who are your neighbors, who are working and living where you are. I would suggest this is a contemporary phenomenon that is increased. We can live somewhere and not know any of our neighbors and not really care about them. So what do you make of that, Maria? Do you find it accurate? And if so, what are ways people can re-engage with the local?
Yeah, so just reflecting on my own lived experience, I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a rural community and not in an urban center. And so I think just by virtue of that experience, it was hard to not know your neighbor. Like, it just like wasn't an option to not know your neighbor. We definitely knew our neighbor. It was like, literally I could walk over and like ask them for a cup of sugar if we were out. Like, that was just the kind of tight-knit community that I was blessed to have grown up in. Pending that we had good relationships with this particular neighbor, we didn't always, because my dad is a farmer and sometimes the pigs would get out and the other neighbors would not be very happy. But the point is that we knew each other, right? We knew each other. And that was also very consistent with even just my own cultural background. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm an Indigenous person, and relationships are everything. Like, very big deal for Indigenous people. And I think it lends itself well to intense living, to live in relationship, to live with a view towards the other. And this is definitely not something that I've seen applied in my urban experience. When I moved to the city to pursue post-secondary, people, particularly in Toronto, tend to be just very, almost seemingly disinterested. Everyone kind of, and I get it, everyone's bustling about, doing their own thing, very busy, going about their own business, but not really taking that time to look at who's right in front of you. And in terms of how to remedy that, I don't have the answer. I think part of it is exposing yourself, taking the time to expose yourself to other ways of living and doing things. So I know that for me, by virtue of being an Indigenous person, really, I understand the importance and centrality of relationships, even in a job where, like the demands of it, the billable hour target, all of those things make it difficult to foster relationships sometimes, but I still try to ensure that it's central to what I do professionally and to how I live my life in my own personal relationships. But I think that's a decision each individual has to make on their own. And in terms of incentivizing them, they have to be convinced that that is going to be the remedy to whatever loneliness they may be feeling in the modern world.
Yeah, I want to say, reflecting back on all of your answers, it's a term that's bandied about, but I mean, what else are you to do but be intentional about things, right? And well, we'll leave that for folks to ponder. Final question, pointing to some statistics about trends in happiness and well-being, perceived happiness. So well-known social theorist Arthur Brooks points to the results of the General Social Survey in the United States over many years, showing that general happiness has continued to decline since the 1970s. As far as I can tell, trends in Canada, they don't have as good longitudinal data, but they have continued to decline from 2005 to 2021. And then there is another so-called a paradox of declining female happiness as well, which I might suggest is maybe only a paradox when we realize that perhaps some of the things that women are seeking today may not be conducive to their natures and what fulfills them. And then, of course, problems of young men, they're well known to people. They're faring quite poorly in school, not attending university in as high numbers, and struggle to find themselves in a world that increasingly gives few positive male role models and even actively denigrates masculinity. And I think we tend to think of our world as increasingly efficient. I think this may be key here. So we create new technologies and processes and systems and rules. They're designed to save us time and effort and make things easier. And they give us control and a certain degree of autonomy. But we are, in fact, busier than ever before, and we even outsource the things to this logic of efficiency as relationships and community and caring for one another. all of these sorts of things. So, and really at the root of that, which Brendan has hit on at the outset, and with the quote from Dorothy Day, we feel a deep loneliness, perhaps an existential loneliness, but it can be magnified maybe in today's day and age. And it's through relationships, it's through community, it's through caring for one another. That's the manifestation of love. That's how we give and how we receive it. So that's my little point to you. Do you think that's maybe an accurate description of what may be driving some of the perceived loneliness, perceived unhappiness in people? This focus on efficiency, control, choice, autonomy. Start with you, Brendan.
Yeah, I think you've got something there for sure. I as you've sort of laid out some of the things that undermines people's happiness today, I think a few things come to mind for me. One is, I think we are feeling the effects of a cultural idea of happiness that is very dependent on our immediate conditions. In church language, we talk about the distinction between happiness and joy, right? That even in suffering as Christians, we can experience a certain joy through unity with Christ, through offering up our suffering for the needs of the world. Like there's a spiritual element where even in difficult situations, we can experience something, again, not happiness, but the cultural idea of happiness as based on our conditions means that as certain of our conditions are not met, life becomes very, very challenging. But the problem is there's a lot of those conditions, not just in the physical sense of good health and a roof over your head, and not to subtract from any of those because those conditions are important. I think it extends even to a certain kind of spiritual poverty where we don't have a language for the meaning of existence, the purpose of life, what we're made for, the fact that we have souls. So when you don't have that kind of overarching map of what it means to be human, it is very easy to fall into ideologies of all kinds that tell you that your happiness is contingent on something that's always dying. By which I mean, your happiness is contingent on your health, which is always frittering away. Your happiness is contingent on your wealth, which will never quite do the job. Your happiness is contingent on your reputation through your work, that you do something prestigious, but you're always, slowly and steadily marching towards no longer being at the top of your professional field or whatever the case may be. So we place our happiness in these things that are dying. And then we're shocked when, for example, to bring in a separate issue, we read stories since Canada legalized euthanasia federally that people with serious mental health problems feel lonely, alone, unsupported, and decide that the best solution is to seek their own death. That's not, to me, a shocking outcome of a society that doesn't offer a path to joy for people. And also doesn't meet their material conditions. We lived in a time of intense inequality, where people don't have access to necessities, despite the fact we're one of the wealthiest societies in the history of the world. So, there's a lot of interrelated pieces here. So, but I would say that in that darkness, we have, as we've always had as Christians, the most powerful tonic to offer, which is the only person that has ever come up with the solution to that, which is Christ, right? It's been true. It was true in 0001 BC, and it's true today, right? Or AD, sorry. But so I think, I think we have there's such spiritual poverty in this time, not in the good sense. There's such spiritual deprivation in this time that I think preaching the gospel, always important, but I think there's so much more space for it now in that context of what we've lost.
Yeah, I think you've made some really good points here. There's one that I guess I wanted to focus on that I kind of was reflecting on. we try to look for happiness in lots of places where we're not going to find it. And I think one area that I've been pondering is on kind of career and careerism. And it's interesting that you kind of bring up this idea of, maybe males as they're younger, like not doing as well in school and university, maybe not getting those jobs that they want or that they need to provide their families. And then on the flip side, women that are kind of outperforming males in school and then ending up in really high profile jobs and maybe not finding the satisfaction that they want from those jobs. I also recognize that I'm saying this as like a young professional doctor and as a woman, and it's, not meant to be a contradiction, but maybe it is. Both and. I'll have to say that, I think we can try to put or try and look for happiness in places that we're not going to find true joy, actually. I love being a doctor. It's great. I get to help people. It's very service oriented. And I think as a woman, one of my kind of best traits of us women is that we're very nurturing, and I feel that I get to bring that to my work every day when I'm working with patients and comforting them through their illnesses. And so I think it's a really beautiful vocation, but there are definitely struggles, and I won't say too much more about this, but I think it's really great to be able to look at some of the lives of the saints and see what they've done. And I think of, in particular, Saint Gianna Beretta Molla. Some of you may be familiar with her, but she was a young Catholic doctor saint in the 1900s, and she worked as a physician for many years. She got married, and by the time she had her fourth daughter, unfortunately she passed away shortly after that, but the plan for her and her husband was actually for her to significantly cut down on her work, or perhaps even stop working altogether by the time she had her fourth child. And again, I'll leave that kind of for everyone to ponder, and it's something I'm still actively working through in my head about where I see myself in my professional life. But when we're thinking about where we find joy, and maybe not just kind of fleeting happiness, but true joy, I think it's in community. And probably the most fundamental or important community there is the family. And so I think a lot of us are, it's very tempting to look for happiness in other areas and for us to think, like I can earn lots of money too or whatever, but it's not ultimately what's the most fulfilling thing. So something for all of us, including myself, to keep pondering.
You guys have all expressed amazing thoughts. I think that for me, if I were to diagnose, not that I'm a doctor, but if I were to diagnose this issue, I think, as Brendan was saying earlier, it definitely comes down to, I think, spiritual impoverishment and a lack of sense of purpose or mission or direction in life. And I know that for me, I had read somewhere that, at least in the Catholic context, there's people who are, I shouldn't say born with, but who have instilled within them a very strong sense of mission or a strong sense of vocation. And I've always thought the two were like one and the same. And they are, I think. They're definitely related. But I, from a young age, understood that I had an obligation to my community. I had an obligation to my nation, and a lot of Indigenous children tend to be raised in this way, with a very strong sense and obligation towards the collective. If you want to read Jody Wilson-Raisbald's book, The Indian in the Cabinet, she talks about it quite a bit. And I was able to, rely on my faith to direct me towards that path. And then I ended up in law school and practicing Aboriginal law, a whole underlying purpose of which is reconciliation of Indigenous Crown relations. So I was very blessed just by virtue of how I was situated in life. But I understand that not everybody is situated in that way. But I think, again, what's key is that if you have some sort of faith background, some sort of faith foundation that guides you through whatever web that you find yourself in, you'll get through it. I think people think that happiness is somehow like the absence of pain or the absence of suffering. And it's like, no, no, it's definitely, I think you can experience joy for sure. But also happiness even amidst the pain and the suffering. That's one thing my dad used to always say, you have to find joy in the suffering. You have to find happiness in the suffering. And yeah, not everyone has that formation, unfortunately. But yeah, I would say that's the underlying problem here. I probably sound like some preacher. People need God. Like, that's just it. Like, that's just what you need. Or some like wherever you draw your faith from, whatever source that it is. I also, I have two roommates. They're both Hindu who are very faithful Hindus. And I can see how their faith informs their relationships and everything that they do as well. So whatever source of faith that you're coming from, we're talking about in the Catholic context, but whatever guides you along your journey, you have to, I think, be able to draw from that source, draw from that water source, whatever it is.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for such thoughtful comments. Really moving personal anecdotes as well, making it vivid and real, and, showing us joy is found in community, joy in suffering, and in all of those units that, the family, friends, broader society that can be messy and challenging, that is the way. And thank you all for joining us. It's been great to have you here, and we'll look forward to the next Faith and Reason lecture in January with Professor Randy Boyagoda. More news on that to come. We will wrap up with a closing prayer. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, Holy Father, you who are a blessed Trinity, a unity of persons, in your very self, you show us the meaning of love, the meaning of community and relationship. May we always turn to you for that perfect example of joy and community through suffering. Amen.